Good morning and welcome to our first pre-harvest webinar of the series, AGCO Yield Data and Getting It Right. This is part of our data and tech sessions, which are hosted by Farmplan and guest partners to explore the importance of making data and technology work for you to improve performance, better decision making and profitability. So roughly for the next hour, we're going to be our session is going to be looking at some simple ways to ensure a smooth and accurate data flow and capture, directing you towards some of the more basic prep and best practices on the combine terminals and also Gatekeeper ready for harvest. So we'll finish off by looking at how we can get the best use out of the data and full value from it. In between time, you might be lucky enough to find out how to save a little bit of money on precision farming modules as well. So just a few introductions. I'm your host, Simon, this morning, and I'm Regional Account Manager for the East and work with many of the AGCO dealers, such as T&S, Chandler's, P&B, down the East Coast. And of course, my colleagues across the rest of the UK do similar. We've got Adam here, and he's our training services manager. He specialises in Gatekeeper, and he's trained right away across the board, obviously, including growers, agronomists, dealer specialists, and even universities. So he comes with a broad insight over the industry and through Gatekeeper and precision farming as well. Vicky is obviously, as I say, my colleague, and she works with the regional account manager like myself down on the south, and she's also pressing the button this morning and driving the webinar, so thank you. Emily isn't on here, but she's going to be answering any queries, any questions that you guys might have with regards to audio issues or anything like that, so thank you, Emily. And we've also got Andy, who's our Gatekeeper product manager, also on as a panelist today. So he's bringing his massive depth of knowledge about Gatekeeper. So we're well fielded across the board for you. And obviously not forgetting our guest speaker, who we're really pleased to have on board again, Ben Bell from AGCO. He's been with AGCO for 13 years now and is a fuse product engineer. So he's sort of spends his time very much specializing on precision agriculture. And you'll see from the next slide that he's very much part of the fuse smart farming. And that means that he is working with us, working alongside with us with Gatekeeper, and he's got a broad knowledge of AGCO brands. And with it being combines today that we're talking about, then you've got Fendt and Massey Ferguson, I'll call it, instead of Massey, that we're going to be covering. So we move to the next slide, Vic, if that's possible. And we've got the agenda that will be coming up. There we go. Great shot. Wouldn't want to miss the headshot from Ben. And as I say, you'll see all his credentials there. We'll just big you up a bit more, Ben, before we get you in the chair. But that's enough of you. Let's go to the agenda, and we'll be straight into the session. We've got housekeeping. So Adam is going to start off looking at a few simple tips to get the Gatekeeper up and running, ready for harvest and doing the right things, which quite often some simple things are forgotten by some of the users. So hopefully you'll pick up some tips today. Setting up on the task stop is a second part of the agenda, with Ben doing a similar sort of thing, but in the combine cab. And then we've got both looking at sort of the importing of data and making sure they're accurate and usable data once it gets into Gatekeeper. And then Adam will finally be going through making it, once you've got the good usable data in, getting the best use out of it for you and also your business as well. So getting some full value out of what you've got. We'll finish off with the questions and answer session. But otherwise, I'll move this straight on to Adam to pick things up from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Welcome, everyone. As Simon mentioned, we're going to start the webinar by just looking at some of the basics. It might be boring, the housekeeping bits, but they're all necessary. So before we can move on to talk about what we might like to do with our data, best practice in collecting it, etc., we've got to start and build ourselves a really good foundation. And before we go into some of the housekeeping tips there, one of the things that I probably should draw to everyone's attention, you may have seen this, but if you haven't been into your Gatekeeper and into the devices section for a little while, we had a release not very long ago which has changed the layout slightly of the device sync window. So when you're looking at that now, if you can see your screen, I've highlighted in red at the top there that rather than before we had the import export tabs, because we are seeing more and more cloud integration and wireless integration happening between FMIS and your in-cab controllers, we've now changed that to be the tabs at the top, where you set your device up in the first place, a local exchange, because we appreciate that people are still using USB transfer and there still is that facility with the AGCO terminals as well, but also there's a cloud exchange button. This is where all of that takes place now, and you'll now find that you've got your download and upload buttons separated onto that. So it's just a slightly different way of working and getting used to your data transfer. If you haven't seen that before, it might be worth getting familiar with before going and getting set up if you're using it on the combine and haven't seen that one yet. Other bits and pieces, they're fairly straightforward, and like I said, it's not the most glamorous of sections, but it's all very necessary for us to try and avoid having to tidy up too many errors when we come back in, when the data is coming back in again. We're going to touch later on about how we can clean up and tidy up our data and things like that, but obviously we want to try and minimize any problems that are going on before we get there, so that the cleanup process is minimal as we can. And one of the first things that people always forget, and is always worth a bit of housekeeping, regardless of whether you're talking about device integration or anything else, it's having a good look through your crops and varieties list. Very often things just get added, they get added to the wrong crop groups, the wrong categories, varieties get added in the wrong place, and that's annoying and can be a bit inconvenient when we're just running reports and trying to filter things in Gatekeeper alone. But when it comes to exchanging data with a device, that's obviously programmed and structured to go in a certain way, and the terminal will be expecting things to receive things in a certain way as well. So if we haven't got crops and varieties set up, or we've got duplicate varieties and things, we can start causing problems for what's being shown on the screen on the other end. So that's always worth just going through and having a bit of a tidy up on that. The tractor units and implements, if there's anybody else using any other manufacturers as well as this one, that they are quite important for some of those, but the AGCO terminals not so much. So whilst it's good practice to tidy up those lists as well, they're not of primary importance when you're exporting back and forth to the AGCO terminals, because that section is not affected. And Ben, please correct me if I'm wrong there, but when we export out to that, that's kind of ignored by the screen anyway. But it is the stuff like the crops and varieties, field names being correct, all that sort of stuff we want to make sure is correct before we start passing it out. And the field names, etc., that all those naming conventions being correct, all the product names being correct, and not having duplicate products and things. One of the biggest things that I urge everybody to have a look at pre-harvest is please go through and have a look at your boundaries, because poor boundary management is probably one of the single biggest reasons for issues and data not being recorded properly, only seeing partial data, half data, etc. Even more so when we're trying to export boundaries out to a device, especially for applications. The issues with the boundary will normally always be somewhere at the top of why things are going wrong. Now, I would suggest that a good practice to get into is treating your boundary management a little bit like when you're setting your cropping up every year. It's an annual task that you have to do. So when you're using Gatekeeper every year, you have to create your cropping plan, and you have to go through, set the fields up and allocate your different crops and varieties into those fields. But as you can see on the screenshot, the region tab within the cropping record is actually where the boundary resides. We have something called, so the region template we can see there is the shape that field is occupying within the Gatekeeper database in that particular cropping year. Now you can store lots and lots of different regions. So this is how we can enable fields to be different shapes in different years by swapping the regions that they are. And if you think about it simply as just a collection of little card templates that we store in with each cropping record, if you want a paper analogy for it, we simply pick out the template that we want for that year and we associate it with that cropping record in that file in that year. So that means that as fields change shape, invariably they do, and sometimes quite often as well, we can allocate different boundary shapes, different cropping seasons. But again, if we're getting that right from the word go, so when we come to the 22 season, I would just suggest trying to make that part of your setting up your cropping routine, looking at your boundaries, getting them done. And actually, that's not a bad time of year to change boundaries and update them as well, because we'll have cultivation tasks and drills going out. Well, they're going to be the first things in the field, and they're going to be recording what is going to be the growing sort of area for that season ahead. So then's a good time to go and update all your boundaries as well. So just a little plea on that one, just to sort of maybe step up, if not before. A lot of people don't look at their boundaries too often year to year, and it's not until we start bringing yield data in and we see that we've only got half the yield data appearing or something in Gatekeeper that we realise that we've got boundary issues, or we didn't have a boundary in the first place, or it's the wrong shape, etc. So now's a good time to have a good look at these and tidy them up. But like I say, is maybe it's a proactive and preemptive measure. Try incorporating it in as part of the routine as well. And the only other thing I mentioned there as well was just paying attention to our output products and varieties. So it may well be very useful to go into your setup products, have a look at your primary output headings, and start setting up and thinking about what output products you want in Gatekeeper. And there is no right or wrong way to do that. So what you might like to do, some people like to go down all the way down to variety level. And that's fine, and put a variety product in against for each of those varieties that are being grown on farm, and create separate jobs for each of those, which may be exported out to the combine. Some people just like to keep it fairly generic, and for example, just have an output product that's called feed wheat or milling wheat or just barley. All of the above are absolutely fine, but the only thing you need to consider is what you want to report on at the end of it. Because obviously, if we only have one generic product, we can only apply one price to that. So if you are going to use your yield data when it comes back in again to start filling up your stock and to start making grain sales with, we need the different products broken down at a slightly more granular level so that we're able to include them in transactions, or maybe do a little bit more in-depth analysis reporting on varietal performance and getting into the costs and how we're performing on different things slightly more. And then the other thing to remember and bear in mind with your crops and varieties is there is a feature in Gatekeeper, or functionality, whereby when you import your yield data, that data, if a moisture figure is entered either against the product or against the crop, Gatekeeper will automatically try and reduce the wet weight down to the dried weight based on the figure that you've entered in there. And it's available in two separate places in Gatekeeper. So the first place is if you go into set up crops and varieties, against the crop level itself, you will find a place where you can enter a moisture value. And the other place you find it is down at the product level. So if you are setting up a number of different products for different varieties, you can go and put it in there as well. The only thing you need to remember is that if you put it down at the product level, that will win. So it will override anything that you then put in at the crop level as well. So it's just worth bearing in mind which one you want to set up. If you kind of just a broad approach, pop it in at the crop level, and then Gatekeeper will automatically make that moisture shrink adjustment as it brings that yield data in, so that you've got a little bit less calibration to do once the data is in and sorted. So really, field names, consistent, naming conventions all set up properly, boundaries are all accurate before it goes out, crops and varieties all set up neatly with a moisture value added. And just, if you haven't done already, familiarise a little bit with the new device sync window on there. And then with that, I think I'll pass across to Ben to take us through the next stage.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Could we just have the next slide, please, Vicky? Okay, thank you. So just going to talk about some basic housekeeping things, Adam, to start with, and then we're going to run on to a video showing the operation on the machine itself. So I guess some important things to note. I mean, in this demonstration, we've been using the Ideal Combine. Most, but not all of it, would apply to a Centaur or a Delta. Anything with the, what we refer to as the Fendt terminal, but the 10.4-inch terminal, has this functionality to transmit data wirelessly. The USB is only working on the Ideal. So Task Doc Basic and Task Doc Pro, we have sort of 2 levels of functionality. When we refer to Task Doc Basic, we're normally referring to a USB data transfer, and this could be in a tractor or a combine. That's your entry-level basic way of getting your data off your combine. It's absolutely fine. Obviously, it's low cost, it's simple. Where it goes wrong a little bit, people get a bit confused with it. They get USBs all over the place with bits of yield data on, and you get a bit confused as to maybe you've got last year's data mixed up with this year's data, or something happens to the USB stick, the data transfer gets corrupted. And so in many ways, the wireless system, whilst it may seem a little bit daunting, is probably a better solution. The data transfer is secure. So when the combine transfers, it does a data verification, and the same when it comes from the server back into Gatekeeper, the data is verified. And how it works is basically on your machine, we have this, as you can see in front of this little module called a VDO3, which is our navigation controller for the auto guide system. It needs a GPS position, so it picks up that off the GPS receiver. So when you're recording yield data, it's obviously location based, and so this sampling takes place continually in the field. And then that VDO3, there's a little SIM card slot in it, and you can pop a SIM card in there. It has an inbuilt aerial. You can get an external antenna as well, but it will work perfectly fine for data transfer without the external aerial. So just pop a little SIM card in there, and it will connect to the Task Doc server. So obviously there's some setup for that, and there is a bit of a charge. So we operate the Task Doc server as a subscription-based service. It's not particularly expensive. You can get a short 1-month subscription for harvest for, I believe, £22.50 or just under. So if you want to do that purely on your combine harvester for harvest, it's not an expensive thing to set up. And at least at that, you can make these continual checks that the system's running and is working correctly. So Nigel will go out and do your first field, check the data transfer, bring it back into Gatekeeper. It's all running. Or we may need to just check some of the settings. So one of the other things I would just make a note of is calibration. So the yield meter on the combine, as I'm sure you'll be familiar, does require calibrating, and it's an ongoing task to get any level of accuracy. I think you need to sort of view this as an ongoing job. You can get within sort of a few percent quite easily, but to really narrow it down, it is a continual job. And we would suggest you do a tank full or a trailer full, and just keep an eye on that and update it as you change crops, change varieties, and weather conditions change. The readings will just vary slightly. Now, it's not ultimately important for your yield mapping, but if it's a long way out, you will have to adjust your harvested data in Gatekeeper, so you can do that like a post calibration in Gatekeeper. But obviously it's handy, and the data is more useful if the stored crop is more closely representing what you've actually got in the shed. So you'll note on the combine, we would give you 2 weights. So you go and harvest a field, we would give you a wet weight and a dry weight. On the Ideal combine last year, there were some issues with the wet weight, the dry weight not displaying correctly. It should be sorted for this year, but the wet weight was always okay. That will come into Gatekeeper and be imported. Now you will notice a discrepancy probably on the harvested weight that the combine may print off and tell you compared to the weight reported in Gatekeeper. This is perfectly normal, and it's something you will just have to calibrate out with use, and it's because the data is built up on the combine continually. As we're going along, we're continually recording the yield data, taking several samples a second. When the data is imported into Gatekeeper, we're taking the individual plot data that the combine generates, and Gatekeeper works all that out and adds that up and comes up with its own weight for the crop. So you may find a bit of a discrepancy, but you can calibrate the two out and balance them up. So I'm just going to run a quick poll before we run into the video of how to set it up on the combine. If Vicky can launch the poll, and we'll see how you are transferring your data between the AGCO machines and the office. So I think Vicky will let us know when we have completed the poll.
About half the people voted, so I'll leave it a couple of seconds.
Oh, pretty even split three ways. So yeah, I'm at USB. Yeah, has that simplicity advantage. The wireless, I think, once you've used the wireless system, and it is an ever-improving system. Like many computer systems, they evolve over time, and certainly you'll see that improving over years. The functionality will improve, and obviously a few people not doing the transfer at all at the moment, which is perfectly normal. So if Vicky will run the video, this should hopefully just guide through some of the settings on the combine and kind of show the process in action.
I'd like to just show you some of the settings we can make on the terminal that make data capture and recording a little bit easier, but also more reliable for the operator. The first thing I'd like to show you is under the combine main menu. So in the top right hand corner, we press the combine, enter the main menu, and then under header settings, we can set this red line, and this currently shows 90 and has got a notepad next to it. And what it's referring to is the height at which the job computer or the data recording turns on and off. Now it is also the height that the header goes to on an automatic headland turn feature. So when you click your headland sequence, the header will lift up to this height. So I would normally suggest we set that at a height that's clearly out of work when it's on it or above it, and clearly in work when we're below it. So somewhere 50, 60, 70% is normally adequate. Set that, and that's where the header will go to for our headland turn, and it's also the point at which we turn on and off our data recording. Remember, we might not always use the headland turn button. We might just manually lift the header up and down. So don't set it too low, because if you stop in the middle of a field, maybe you've got a blockage or something and you just want to lift it up a bit and reverse, you don't necessarily want to turn on and off the data recording. Conversely, don't set it too high, so that if you lift manually at the end for some reason, you may not lift high enough to trigger the data recording to cut off. So somewhere in that 50 to 70% is probably, will suit most people, but again, depending on circumstances. Just back to the main menu. The second feature I'd like to show you, which I think is really handy, is under the guidance menu. Press that a couple of times, and then at the top we've got the field menu and then the spanner. Within the spanner we've got field assistant, and we can turn on automatic field detection. What will happen now is when the combine passes a field boundary, now this boundary could have been preloaded into the combine via USB stick, or it could have been sent to the combine with a job from Gatekeeper wirelessly. Obviously that makes a really nice solution. When you go in the field, it recognises you're in that field, it will offer you the choice of waylines for that field, and also with another setting we'll make in a minute, will prompt you to start a task. So let's have a look at the final settings. In the Notepad, which is our task menu, we'll find the spanner button. If we press the spanner, here there's a few settings we can set. at the bottom, we've got automatic task handling. So this is currently deactivated. I'm going to activate it now. And what will happen now is when we cross a field boundary, the combine will prompt us to do a task. Now, if a task is already there, so if you'd been well prepared for harvest, and in Gatekeeper you'd created a task for, say, harvesting first wheat, selected all your first wheat fields, sent that to the combine. When we go in one of those first wheat fields, the task will be there, and it will prompt us to start that task, as we'll see in a second, and start harvesting. Now, when we leave the field, we've got some choice of what happens. That's the second part of the menu down here. Now, again, when we cross the field boundary, it's going to give us this choice. Do we want to continue with the current task? Do we want to automatically book the task? Or do we want to be prompted to pause and then maybe start the task? Now, I find that the most useful one, because you're not necessarily going to leave the field and have finished it every time. And you certainly don't want to leave the field and carry on recording, because that makes for untidy yield maps. So the middle one makes good sense. And we'll see what happens shortly. So the combine here is currently set up for USB data transfer. Now, if we're going to use the server and connect wirelessly to Gatekeeper, then we need to make a change here. And we simply click on USB device, select cellular, press tick, and then after a short while, you'll see we'll get 2 ticks in here, and the system will enable a connection to the server. Now, this combine is not currently set up at the moment, and you can do a quick test by pressing this button here, and you can see it runs through basically all the features that need to be on the combine to make that connection. So we're going to set that up in a second and then carry on and show you what happens when we go in and out of the field. All that's set, so let's see now what happens when we go to the field. So when the ignition is turned on and the terminal boots up, the first thing it will do is dial into the server and check to see if there's any task data available. Here we can see there is. Simply press the tick and then it prompts you to download the task data. This takes just a few seconds normally. Once it's downloaded, just press the tick to accept the data is imported correctly. Now, as we drive into the field, we'll see what happens. First, as we cross the field boundary, the automatic field recognition has worked and recognised that we're in middle field. Press the tick to accept. That loads up. And because we've sent a task wirelessly from Gatekeeper to the machine, the task is present here. If it hadn't been, it would be prompted to create a task by pressing the plus button. The combine then builds the data in the task, so it adds the combine to it, it's added the field to it. And we can see we've got that customer farm field structure, which will be useful when we're importing back into Gatekeeper. Now the task is not going to be carried out. As you can see, it's not quite ready. What we're going to do, we're going to reverse out of the field, and then you'll see what happens as we cross the field boundary again, but this time leaving the field. So we're just backing out now. Now we set the terminal to prompt us when we left the field as to what to do, and so now it's prompting us here to say what you want to do. So we're going to select book the task to finish the job. Takes us to the booking page. Here we've got the option of a normal tick or a tick with a notepad which would copy the task, so it'd book it but leave a copy on the terminal. For us, we just press a single tick and the job is done and gone off the terminal. And that's it. All good.
Okay, so I hope you found that useful. So that was on an ideal combine. The Centaur Delta is slightly different in that you don't have the automatic task handling feature, and you don't have the USB feature, but yeah, the wireless setup is essentially the same otherwise, and the data recording is the same. So I think we're going to move on to Adam now, just to follow the data through that we've generated and bring that into Gatekeeper and process it and produce a yield map.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Ben, and really great video there. I really like that, and I think it really highlighted how much you can make the operator's life a little bit easier. And they've got enough on their plate as it is during that time of year without having to think about things. But you can see the things I was talking about earlier on about making sure that we've got our product set up correctly, the field naming structure, etc. If we can pass all that out, you saw that come up on the screen there, and that was sent genuinely directly from a Gatekeeper license here to the combine that we're working with, and that was all populated for it. And then those other features that Ben described, really useful things like the task handling, booking and things, the automatic field recognition, etc. If we've got everything lined up, that's why that bit is so important when we send it out. All those features come into play on the combine that Ben was talking about, and they do make things a lot easier for capturing that data more accurately. And like I say, making the operator's life a little bit easier as well. But when we get that data back in, that task has been booked and it's been received back into Gatekeeper, inevitably we are going to see some errors in there. It's going to happen for various different reasons. And I just wanted to talk through a couple of the things that may be creeping into your data, or you may have seen in the past. And if you've never looked sort of below the contour map and sort of peer below the surface on your yield data, I would encourage you to have a look and understand how your data is constructed. So obviously we've got a route trace being plotted by the GPS, and then we have plots being overlaid onto that. So we're taking the recordings and they're being plotted every couple of seconds along there, and that's what gives us our fuzzy looking map on here. Gatekeeper then has to try and do something with that in case there are gaps with that data, or do something with missing parts of data. So we run it through a gridding method, which is just an algorithm which makes assumptions on areas that we haven't perhaps captured data on, that are missing, to try and smooth out and fill in the blanks. Once that's been done, then we can create our contour map over the top of that. But the contour maps that we're all familiar with seeing go through a number of processes to get constructed in the first place, and underlying all of that is this raw data that we're getting passed back from the combine into Gatekeeper here. So starting with the one on the left there, some things that you might run into, calibration issues being the first one. So the example field that we've got here was actually cut by two different combines, one around the headland, one on the middle piece, and they were just set up very, very slightly differently when they're coming in. So we're looking like we're getting headland effect there, we're getting poor yield on the outside. In fact, we're not, it's just that we've got two separate calibration readings on the two separate files. So don't forget, we can have as many combines working in on the same field as we want, and we can bring those in separately, even from different manufacturers, into the same field and stitch it all together again within Gatekeeper. But that may result in a few things like this. But that's easy to sort out. There is an option within Gatekeeper to go through by calibration factor if it's known, or simply adjusting the weight of that section to bring it into line with what it should be on there. The second one we got there, you might not be able to see it there. There's a very, very small red spot just in front of the two. And sometimes when there are difficult combining conditions, when we've got wet or lodged crops and we're having to back up and go in again, we suddenly get a blockage for whatever reason. We create an artificially very low yielding spot, but then it might suddenly peak up again to an artificially, spiking too high again. So we want to be able to remove errors like that, sort of stuff like that. At the start and at the end of passes, we are going to see lower yielding spots, which aren't actually true. It's just simply to do with the flow of the crop material being passed in front of the sensors. So you're going to see little red spots as you're coming out, and possibly get setting into the pass as well. I believe Ben might educate me on this one as well, but I think there's a feature on the Ideal combines and some of the others, isn't there, Ben, to sort of take some of those out of the start of pass?
Yeah, you can adjust the lead and the lag. So basically, from the point of putting the header into the crop, there's a essentially count how long it takes before the crop starts recording on the yield monitor. Likewise, when you come out of work, how long it is before the crop flow stops coming through the yield monitor. And there's some default settings in there, but your local dealer or harvesting specialist will be able to help you set that up.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ben. So where are we down to now? Number 4, field shape. We don't have very often wonderfully square fields that are perfect shapes for any kind of field work, let alone combining, and we are going to find that we are going to have overlaps. We're going to come back, we're going to have to come back and pick up little strips that have been missed. You're going to be travelling over previously cut swaths, all sorts of things where the field shape is causing us to not take a full header width each time. Again, this can result in us seeing some artificially low yielding runs in between there, but again, we can clean all of that out on there. On this particular field here, I put in number 5, you can see 5 twice on there. Don't know if anybody can see that when there's sort of 2 diagonal lines running down through from top to bottom there, from the top left hand corner, and the little bit where it pops out in the top right running down to the bottom. They're actually footpaths within that field, so we're getting little indentation through the yield data running through there of where those footpaths run, showing a low yielding area, which again highlights the fact that data is very, very useful and valuable, but you've got to know the fields as well to understand what you're seeing in there, because sometimes not all the errors are created by the combine, and sometimes they're not even problems, they are just simply features within that field that are causing the data to appear in a certain way. So good field knowledge always needs to be accompanied when we're looking and interpreting our data as well. And then if we move on to the next slide there, please. So when it comes to sorting out those problems, so we've looked at what the problems are, but there are ways that we can fix those when we actually get the data back into Gatekeeper. So on the right hand side there, you can actually see middle field, which is the one that Ben was in there before. Obviously that's previous year's harvest data there, but it's still from that same set of data, same combine that we were looking at over there. And so we're in the job screen here in Gatekeeper, and we've come down at the bottom, the tabs at the bottom there. If you're familiar with this, you've got the fields tab at the bottom, and once you go in there, you'll be presented with an image of the data that you've captured on there. And just to the left of the yield map that we can see, the contour map you can see there, you can see there's a little menu popped out of that with layers in there, and that's what we're using to pop up on the right hand side of the screen there. And this is where I say, if you've never done it before, just have a look through that and explore how that data is constructed. You've got lots of layers to look at there, the actual root trace, where the combine was in the field. And sometimes you're going to see multiple files there. So when you expand the actual plots node there, you might see 3, 4, even 5, depending on how many combines were working, how many interruptions there were, etc. We might find lots of different files making up that piece. But if we highlight them all, that will all populate on the right-hand side over there. And like I said, you've got the grid cells on there, so it has to be gridded up in case we've got any missing data or anything that needs to be interpolated from that raw data to create our contour map that we're looking on there. And I think it's just, I've already said it, but just bear it in mind that we're handling the raw data. So that's what you're seeing when you're looking at the contour maps. Gatekeeper is just representing to you what was passed to it, and that's what will be displayed. We never do anything with that data. Everything that is recorded on the combine, warts and all, is passed across to us, and that's what you're seeing there. So that's why the next few steps are important through here, and it is important for a number of reasons to have a look and make sure you are filtering and tidying up the yield data. We're going to look later on about possible uses of our yield data. Well, there are obviously agronomic potential implications if we're using untidy data or making assumptions on things that aren't actually correct, because we're looking at data that's not been cleaned up. So your main 2 options to do that within your Gatekeeper program, if you look into the left there where the arrows are pointing to, we've got 2 functions. We've got filter plots and calibrating the job. Well, the first thing that we looked at on that other field there was a calibration issue. And if you go into calibrate job, you'll find that you will have all the interruptions, all the files listed for you within that particular job. And then you'll be able to select individual files or multiple files all at once to make a complete field. And then there's different ways we can calibrate that up to. So probably the most common way is to use the new subtotal job quantity, where we've got a known weight for that field, and we can just enter a fresh quantity in there. Like Ben said, there may be a little bit of difference between what the combine is calculating on the screen, because that's doing its own calculations. When we've received all that plot data back into Gatekeeper, that is all totaled up and it's calculated across the boundary, the working area within the cropping record of that field. So we can correct that though and bring that down, and all your proportions there with your contours flowing across the field, they will all stay relatively the same, but they will be lowered or raised to fit that new subtotal quantity that we're looking at in there. If it's available on the combine, there is a calibration factor that you can adjust to as well. If it's known, if you've got 2 different combines working in, or you come back on a different day and you've been in a different crop in between or something, and you didn't recalibrate it, then you can reset that, put that a calibration factor in there. The other way of doing this is the first tick box option on there, which is a little bit small to see on the screen. It actually says job total quantity. So the other way for this, when we're putting in that new subtotal quantity, we're looking at fixing the quantities from the job to maybe influence what we've got in stock. The job total quantity does it in reverse. So if you're coming to this much later on and you're using Gatekeeper perhaps to record your grain sales, and you've got some transactions with deliveries leaving as the grain is sold, and then we do a stock reconciliation to tidy up our final quantities within our stock module, that might be the trusted figure we want to use now. Well, we can ask Gatekeeper to go back and adjust the maps based on what the stock is currently showing in there. So we can approach it from both ends, basically. You can either tidy up the stock and then let that inform the map, or we can tidy up the job and the map and let that inform the stock, depending on which way you're wanting to operate that. But underneath all of that, there is a reset to original button on there. Like I said, we never delete or do anything with that raw data. It comes into us and it's always there. We simply just modify that, or we hide plots in the filter, etc. But there's always that reset to original, so you can go back if things get completed or changed in error on that. So that's the calibration part on there. The other thing we've got to be able to clean and tidy our yield data is the filter option. So when we're looking at filtering plots, we've got a series. Basically, we open that up, and what we can do is we can create a template. So we don't have to, this doesn't have to be a very long-winded task every year. It looks very involved, but once you've, like a lot of things, done the legwork, done the foundation work, set things up, these templates can be run very quickly year on year. And again, if you've spoken to any of us before it shows, or just phoned in or talked to anything, we'll bang on and on about harvest plans and setting up a harvest job prior to it. And one of the reasons for that is to speed up the cleaning process of this data when it comes back in. Because if I've got just one job, one field in one single job, I have to keep going in and out of all those different jobs to clean all that yield data. If I've got 5, 6, 10 fields all in one job because they're sharing that same output product, I can run the filter across all those fields in one hit. It also makes life easier coming to view job maps. Very nice. If you go into the little tip here, if you go into the field map at this point within the job, you'll be presented with just that one field, but in the top left-hand corner near the active tools, there'll be a show all job fields. And then if you've got all the fields from in one particular block, they'll all populate at once, which if you're printing maps off, that's quite a nice place to go and run those maps for use later on. But back to the filters, I advise you set them up as templates for each crop, and then what we can do is we can run that filter across them all. And within that filter, we just set our permissible range of criteria. So for example, a minimum and a maximum spot rate that we might likely find within that field, and Gatekeeper will hide from the grid all of the plots that fall outside of that range. We can set criteria so that we want to look at plots that only fall within a certain width, or that are discounted if there's an overlap of more than X that we are comfortable with on there. Obviously, that's going to be quite small if you're running RTK guidance on the combine. You probably don't have much filtering to do with that. But if you are finding, like I say, where there's short work, if you're finding little runs where you've got very low yielding spots, and we know that's not true, we can cut those out by using the overlap or the width filter on there. The maximum and minimum speeds and the change in percentage of speed actually work in a couple of different ways. Obviously, the obvious one is the forward speed of the combine, and sometimes the forward speed of the combine can influence what we're seeing in terms of how quickly the crop material is passed up and recorded at that point. So sometimes the driving style of the operator can have an influence on what the yield data looks like. So we can, again, apply a filter between an acceptable working range of forward speed on there. But also for any customers who are working in areas where you've got slopes and the combines up and down, if you've ever seen stripy yield data, i.e. alternately high and yielding runs within your fields because it's on a slope, we've got a similar thing. It can actually be corrected using the speed function as well, because it's not too dissimilar a thing that's occurring in terms of the way that the crop material is passed in front of the sensors. So again, they can be used with that in conjunction with calibration to get those reduced out of the way. And also we've got the start of pass delay as well. So if we don't set that on the combine, we can ask it to ignore the first few seconds of a pass before it's going in, and that together with the minimum rates will take out the majority of your erroneous plots that you're seeing on there. So that's how we end up with some nice cleaned up data. We're all very familiar with looking at contour maps under there, but like I said at the start, I think it's important that we understand where those contour maps have come from, and there is data underneath that and creating that contour map on there, and don't always be fooled by what you can see. So for example there, just one last tip before I pass on, you can go and create your own keys in Gatekeeper as well. You know, you can manipulate that data to make it look any way you want. So never be fooled just by the colors on a map, because you can adjust those, you can adjust how many bands are in that contour map to suit what you want to do. Just try and understand and have a bit more of a working relationship, can I call it, with that data underneath there, because that's the foundational bit of that, and that's the important piece of what we're looking at and what we're going to be working with afterwards, especially if we're going to turn this yield data into something functioning afterwards, variable rate applications or anything else that we're going to look at. So with that, I'll just pass on to the next section.
I think we've got a poll to run. We're going to have a quick poll just to see what people were actually doing with the data and seeing if you were working.
So the poll question that we're going to be asking is, do you capture data in Gatekeeper for management purposes? So you should see an option on your screen. Give it a few moments so that everyone has time to vote.
Just while that's running in there, I've noticed there are a couple of questions in there. We will get to the questions. Then we've got a whole section for that. So if they don't get answered straight away, please don't think we haven't we've forgotten about those. We'll be dealing with those as we can.
Well, there's a few votes still coming in, so. These last ones.
It's looking positive. It's looking good.
Yeah, it is.
Good interactive users of Gatekeeper, which is excellent.
Brilliant. I think most people have voted, so I'll close that and pop those results on the screen.
No, that's nice to know, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. I'll hide that and I'll pass back over to Adam.
Okay. So this is where I'm going to invite maybe some comments from my colleagues here as well, because obviously looking at the customers field that was used in this webinar, and particularly here, and I think Ben, he's been using that. He's been collecting the data for a number of years and has been using that for different reasons on farm, and other customers you've got have been using their yield data for various management purposes. Ben, can you hear me?
Yep. Sorry, I was on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah, so and it is the key. You obviously, a lot of people are generating data all the time, and as we saw on the poll, there's just over a third of people using the data for the management decisions. But that is probably where the real payback comes, isn't it? To actually take the time, look at this yield data, identify areas of concern or areas to investigate, and then take action to address that, to either improve the outcome or to put it into a different use. That would land into a bit of different use.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's in the bottom right-hand corner there. We've actually got that's a real-life example. One of our customers fields who uses Gatekeeper very, very well. Actually, has been collecting as applied yield data, all his sensor data, everything's been being fed into Gatekeeper for a number of years, and he's used the margin map function to quite a novel effect there. So what he's done there, he's used his margin maps are in Gatekeeper to look at the areas of the field that are not profitable. And this was taken a couple of years back when we had an exceptionally wet back end and start of the year. What he's done there is he's looked at margin maps, looked where he's not making any money on those fields, and actually dug some huge potholes into those and drained his land into those areas that weren't profitable in the field. And you can see around him his neighbour's field suffering still there, his field's looking nice and bone dry there, all that data flowing into those ponds. And that was genuinely from the data he's been collecting. So he's been layering up his as applied data in there. So every time he's been making any variable rate activity, the as applied data is coming back into Gatekeeper, all the costs and everything else recorded into Gatekeeper, the yield data finally layered on top of that, and that's showing us spatially what areas of the field are performing to us. So it's like a contour map, but instead of tons per hectare, it's looking at pounds per hectare instead, which is a nice way of a different way of looking at data, which suddenly puts it in a whole different light there. Going around anti-clockwise, the variable rate activity, you know, yield data can be formed for the basis of a range of variable rate activities. But again, the importance of good data comes to the fore, particularly if we're going to inform our variable rate activity on this. If we are doing variable rate fertilizer applications for P or K based on uncleaned, untidy yield data, we are going to be making assumptions. So if we're using the grid generator in Gatekeeper, or even if you're passing your data across to a service provider and they're doing those calculations for you, whatever offtake values that we are, or the calculations we're using to build those fertilizer application maps, if we haven't cleaned that data first, we're potentially looking at over or under application, which obviously has a financial implication to it. But also, that doesn't also account for the potential agronomic limitations or differences that we're going to encounter on that field and run into from using untidy yield data to inform our variable rate activity. So again, if you are engaged in that, or you want to use Gatekeeper for that, or use your yield data for that in conjunction with your service provider, it is very important that data is looked at and make sure we're cleaning that up before we go any further with that. And then on the right hand side, another example of what we might want to do with our yield data, or one use that we can use within Gatekeeper, is using the normalized yield data function within Gatekeeper. So you actually find the normalized yield data function within the geoanalysis section of our farm mapping part of Gatekeeper. So if you need a hand with that, it's actually very simple to construct. We just need to build a map layer and attach a query to it. If you haven't used geoanalysis before, then just get in touch with us, speak to support. We can show you how to run that. And once you've built that, you just simply run it every year. So once the query is built, it's just a case of refreshing the data once a year. And I really like this because it's again puts this data into a different context. You know, if we're looking at a piece of yield data or fields full of yield data in one single given year, we could be seeing low yielding areas or areas that we might identify as problem areas, and they're actually not. They might just be something that we know about that was a problem in that year due to weed, pest, disease, weather, all sorts of reasons have caused us to have an anomaly of yield data in that one field across a number of years. So what we do, what the normalized yield data function allows you to do in Gatekeeper is it overlays and combines and aggregates all of your yield data that you've collected over the years, and you can set it to look back 3, 4, 5, 10 years if you want to. We would suggest that really it's going to be more reliable the more years you have, starting from probably somewhere between 3 and 5 years worth of yield data in your Gatekeeper. Then these really start to bring some value in. And as you can see by the key on the left-hand side, tons are taken out of the equation on here. What Gatekeeper does is it looks at all the yield data and normalizes the yield to within a range of what's to a median. So basically the yellow areas that you can see, that is the average performance of that field across the number of years that you selected to look at. So that could be the average performance across 10 years worth of yield data on there. So now we're starting to look at true trends and real things that are going on with that field. We're not looking at these anomalies that are just afflicting us in one particular given year, which might send us off down the wrong path. We're looking at aggregated data, which is showing us long-term trends on that field. And you can see as you go above the yellow and grey areas as we go into the 120, 130%, those are areas that are consistently better performing than the average. And then as you go below that to the 80, 70, 60%, they are underperforming compared to the median average for that field over the years. And it doesn't matter, combinable crops, obviously it's looking at stuff with yield data, and we've got ranges in there. But so obviously we've got some crops that have a low range from 1 to 5, and then others from 3 to 10, etc. It looks at what's the median for that crop, and that's why it doesn't do it in a tons per hectare. It does it in a percentage figure, because it goes through a very clever normalizing process to bring those all down. So what's the average yield of your oilseed rape? What's the average yield of that? Well, that's where it brings that into there. So it's a very useful factor for when you're looking at trying to make longer term management decisions on this. And there's probably a number of other things, areas that we can go into as well. Some of the immediate secondary benefits of bringing your yield data in. Bringing my yield data in, I'm automatically getting or creating harvest jobs as well. If you've got Sentinel Active switched on, you're getting verification on harvest intervals by starting to incorporate your yield data into Gatekeeper. We're getting our work records filled in because documentation is running on the combine. We're getting dates, tonnages, etc., all filled in as we go along. And then also, as soon as that yield data comes in, not only do we get the data in and the job completed, we're getting that amount of quantity from the job to put into our stock center as well. So if we are running, like I say, running grain sales and things through Gatekeeper as well, or just making a note of them for gross margin reporting, we're doing that all at the same time while we're bringing our yield data in. So there's a number of benefits that spin off from importing that yield data and tidying up and making it look more realistic. So there may be some people who are already doing these things very well, and which is brilliant. And again, if you ever need our assistance, we're always here to help. If you've got queries, you want to start going down the road of something and exploring using the grid generator in Gatekeeper to create your own variable rate activity, or whether you just need a bit of a hand importing some of the yield data, and actually just going back to those normalized yield maps. If you have got historic data sat somewhere else outside of Gatekeeper, it's never too late. We have a historic yield import function. So if you have just been manually recording your yields into Gatekeeper up until this point, we can actually import those yield maps and append those to the previously entered jobs on there. So if there is yield data sitting about, laying about, languishing in drawers on USB sticks, etc., I would say now's the time, get it out, pop it into Gatekeeper, and we might be able to, extract some value from that Gatekeeper after recording. Like Ben says, we're amassing data all over the place, and we ought to be looking at how do we get the best value out of that, and what are the reasons we're collecting it for. Before we go into the next cycle after our yield data and starting collecting more data again. So I think that ends the little section there, and if there's any comments from colleagues on any of that, let's carry on the conversation, or we can move on to I think the final poll, if I'm correct.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And so the final poll that we've got for today is some really interesting stuff that we've just talked through. Are you now more likely to use your data for management purposes like we've just discussed? So I'll just launch the poll for everybody.
To be interesting, because it seems we've got quite a proactive audience anyway on this, but maybe there's a few ideas that have come in through there. There was
quite a lot of sort of like non-applicable in the last poll, so it'd be interesting. Hopefully, with
you turned a few no's to yeses, Adam. So that's well done.
Yeah, it's really good to see.
It is.
Most people have probably voted. I'll give it another couple of seconds. That's great. I'll just share those results with you all.
Fantastic.
Looks like we're going to be busy setting this up.
Yeah.
That's yeah, very encouraging to see. That's great, fantastic, and I'm sure Ben's the same on the combine side, on the machinery side of it. But and I hope that comes across with this webinar. Doing this data and tech series with our industry partners, there is collaboration out there. We do want us to help you all succeed in what you're doing. So, you know, we are always genuinely here if there's anything that we can do. And Ben, I'm sure the same from your side as well.
Yeah, and any customers out there who want to do this with their combines, or for that matter with tractors, if they want to record their activities with their tractors, get in touch. We can do a lot of the support over the phone. We don't necessarily need to visit you all the time, but if a visit's required, we can certainly arrange that. And it'd be a pleasure to help you get set up to make this a reality.
Fantastic. So I think there are some good questions coming in, which I'm not sure have been dealt with while I've been talking about the last slide there. But if we want, Vicky, have you got some questions you want to share, or Simon?
I think the next.
Yeah, I'll pass over to the Q&A in just a moment. But Simon, do you want to talk through?
Yeah, just looking at the last. If you can just flick this next slide up. Just looking at a last poll. You know, if some of you are interested in getting a little bit more out of Gatekeeper and you're sat there without the mapping tool and just interrogating what else you can get out of it and what you can do with the integration with the kit, then we're just trying to encourage that. So and for this harvest, so we've got a limited time up to the end of July on a bundle that would normally include the mapping, Bing maps and the precision modules, and that's well over £1,300 normally. So we're brought a significant discounted offer in here at $695 plus the VAT. So as I say, we're trying to make it as appetizing as possible for you guys to sort of carry out your wishes to get more of this pulled together and managed for you. So as I say, by all means, give us a call on the number there, the sales number there. Have a chat through. Anybody who's got mapping already but want to get a couple of those modules, then we can do some pricing on that as well. Again, similar sort of discounting involved. So yeah, it's there and it's there to be had before the end of July. But otherwise, we'll go on to the questions, and Vic's sort of been collating some of them as we're going. But if we have got some questions which are sort of more on a personal basis, individual, then we'll tend to come back to you after the webinar and answer that. But otherwise, we'll try and look at questions being beneficial to everybody.
Fab, thank you, Simon. Unless there's a question sort of targeted at somebody, please everyone feel free to jump in and answer. So we've got a question coming in here. Is all the data integration that's been discussed available with Massey Ferguson as well as Fendt?
Basically, yes. So if you've got an ideal combine, it makes no difference whatever, whether it's a Massey Ferguson or a Fendt. Tractor-wise, basically all the new Massey Ferguson and Fendt tractors probably made in the last definitely 3 years. Yeah, some models going back more than that will have this, capability to handle this data transfer and generate and use data in much the same way. So we operate on a pretty common platform, and the same would apply for Voucher as well. It's a common platform in the background.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a question that's come in asking which Isoxml version should we be using?
I think I'll jump in there. So currently, Gatekeeper's handles versions 2 and 4. I mean, the way to look at it is the versions are backwardly compatible, but always give you a bit more. So version 4 has a few more options in it to log things than version 3, and vice versa for version 2, and going back. So Gatekeeper can handle version 2 and version 4 with the last update that we just released. I believe, Ben, you guys are logging at version 3 currently.
We can currently handle 1, 2, and 3, and we plan to move to version 4 this autumn for our generated data also. But, I think for version 4 will give us some added benefits of, I believe the task sent can then manage the data on the terminal. So you can sort of, you can send a new field boundary to a terminal, and that will overwrite the data that's in the terminal and change it to the new field boundary rather than have two fields. So that should bring some benefit.
I know from our end, the AGCO terminal or device terminal imports version 4, so we're already handling your version 3 fully, and when you go to 4, that will just happen, and that will all work fine. So yeah, so from that perspective, we're handling 4, and you should try and use 4.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks guys. We've got another one that's just come in. Can we use the tick and Notepad to save field data on the terminal as well as sending it out to Gatekeeper, or will it clog the system?
I'm not a great fan of it personally for this sort of job. If you've created a task, particularly on a combine, you're not going to have the same crop in the next year, and so some of the details would be wrong. It's more designed in my mind for those repetitive tasks, so you can have it for ploughing or something like that on a tractor, where you're going to plough a field multiple times. But it can also tend to fill the terminals up a little bit, depending on how many fields you've got. I mean, if you've got 20, 30, 40, 50 fields, that's fine. If you've got 200 or 300 fields, yeah, you're starting to get a lot of tasks sat in the background on the terminal, which might cause you problems as time goes on.
That's brilliant, thank you. Next question we've got is, do I need variable rate or completed variable rate job data to build a margin map?
Not necessarily, no.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, Andy.
No, that's right. Go for it.
Fighting for it.
Probably both just going to say the same things, and no, not necessarily. You don't. The margin map button, if you've never come across it, if you go to your cropping records, highlight a cropping record, along the top you've got margin, which will give you a breakdown, and actually in itself on that margin tab, as soon as you see a yield job present or an output job present, you get an extra column on that grid itself, which I really like because it suddenly presents things in cost per ton. So you start seeing the cost of production with different headings in pounds per ton of your product, but also you see the net and gross margins down there in that figure as well, which I think is a really interesting way to look at things rather than a cost per hectare basis. But just below that, there's a little margin map button, and they're calculated automatically as that data is built up over the years. And in essence, if you don't have any variable rate activity, all it will do is just assume a flat rate application across the field, and it will apply the cost of the products within that job evenly across that field. So essentially your contours will be almost the same as, well, they will be the same as your yield data if there's no other as applied data present, but obviously it will cut those down, and the key that you'll see on the left, like I said, is pounds per hectare rather than your tons per hectare you'd see on your yield map. So yes, you can, in essence, but if you are doing variable rate activity, obviously it's good to get that as applied data back in, because you're going to have a much more informed picture on that when that comes in. And if I can just jump on and answer, Vicky, if you don't mind, Tom Rash's question about running a RDS yield meter on it. Andy might correct me, but as far as I'm aware, they're still supported. We still import data from RDS terminals, not a problem at all. And asking there, Tom, about webinar training, actually a large proportion of what we covered today is generic to wherever the data came from. So running those plot filters, calibrating issues, all that sort of stuff, tidying things up in the way we have, and using that yield data afterwards in the farm mapping mode with the grid generator, etc., is kind of not relevant, but wherever that data was collected, once it's in Gatekeeper, the way we handle it and what we do with it is essentially the same on there. And just a little plug for myself as well, if you've not seen it yet, we now have launched an e-learning platform, so that we're starting to offer digital learning courses, and actually by the end of the week there'll be a course on yield data and understanding your yield data, which will sort of cover some of the points you learned today. So anybody interested for that, please let us know, and we'll send you a link. Phone support, they can send you a link to go to. You just sign up, email address, takes about 10 seconds to get in there, and there's a whole content library building of courses online that you can take. And like I say, yield data is the next one to go in there. So I hope that answers that one, Tom.
That's great, thanks, Ad. We've got another couple to go. Does the ideal have auto section to accurately record the cutting width of the header and calculate the yield? Is this setup automatic?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm 100% sure. I know you can do it manually. I will have to just check with my harvesting specialist on that and maybe come back. So maybe if you could, I don't know if there's any contact details, let me know and I will come back to you personally on that one.
Yeah, we can flag that one up, not a problem. And we've got one more question coming in, and it says, can I import SOYL data using the mapping and PF package?
Yes. Yes, you can. Yes. So obviously, soil can provide kind of applied sampling as well as target data, variable rate maps, and so forth. So yeah, the PF actual and PF target. Obviously, you'll be able to import both lots of them and then pass them out to whatever machine or device within the PF actual hierarchy that you need to send it to. So yes, that is a yes. There was another question there. Also about field data sets and Gatekeeper be made easier to distinguish between farms and customers when multiple people have access to the data. So I suppose that really comes down to the structure of your data. If you're looking at a farm level within farm mapping, then I would suggest that the field maps, sorry, the field groups are used appropriately to distinguish your customers, and therefore you can view the extent of your farm based on field groups, and that way it will be far easier to see the data. If all your fields are multiple customers are all grouped together and very clustered and all intermingled, yes, I appreciate that does become a lot harder. At that point, I would say the easiest way would be to make plans for specific customers and then use the reporting tool, because the report will only show the fields in that plan for said customer only. And that way you can get a nice pretty map of just that customer's fields.
Excellent. That's a good one to finish off. Thank you very much. I think we'll have to call it a day now. So thank you, Andy, Adam, and Emily, and also Vic for the first session you've been driving. So drive it very well. And Ben, thank you again. Excellent guests, some excellent value and detail there. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your time, and hopefully you'll be able to take out some valuable hints and tips from this. Just to let you know, there's more webinars in the series, in the pre-harvest series, and there's going to be more webinars and content within the data and tech series itself. So keep your eyes open, and I look forward to seeing you again. But thank you again for attending this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for yourself.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.